All right, let's go. Number 10. The Shepherd of Hermesis. On the night of February 4th, 1859, Konstantin von Tischendorf could not sleep. He was in a monk's cell at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, and in front of him were 347 leaves of vellum, parchment he had recognized on sight as among the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts in the world. A monastery steward had produced the bundle earlier that day, wrapped in cloth, and Tischendorf had opened it with the careful hands of a man who had trained himself not to show what he felt. The Greek was clean, written in 4 columns per page, the ink dark against pale vellum. He was holding a complete New Testament. He read through to the end of Revelation, and then turned the page. What he found, bound into the same codex, on the same vellum, in the same hand, would not be publicized to general Bible readers for generations. Immediately following Revelation were 2 additional texts, the Epistle of Barnabas and the opening sections of the Shepherd of Hermas. The Shepherd of Hermas is not in any modern Bible. It was written in Rome, most likely between 100 and 160 AD. Irenaeus of Lyons cited it as authoritative around 180 AD. Clement of Alexandria described it as divinely inspired around 200 AD. Origen, writing around 250 AD, called it divinely inspired. 3 consecutive generations of the most influential theological voices in early Christianity treated this text as scripture, spanning roughly 70 years of the Church's formative period. The Muratorian fragment, the oldest surviving Christian canon list, dated to approximately 170 to 200 AD, acknowledged the shepherd's wide readership while recommending it be used privately rather than read in public church services. That was not exclusion. It was the beginning of a managed sidelining. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the shepherd's content in isolation. It's the specific institutional threat its content posed. The text taught that post-baptismal sin could receive a second repentance, forgiveness available once more, even after baptism, for serious transgression. By the mid-3rd century, the dominant institutional position held there was no second repentance, a doctrine that gave the Church direct authority over members who had fallen. When the Novatian Schism erupted in 251 AD, over what to do with Christians who had publicly denied their faith under Roman persecution, the shepherd's theology was on the wrong side of the institutional argument. A text with 3 generations of authoritative citations behind it, physically bound into the oldest complete New Testament, disappeared from the official collection without a recorded council vote, without documented debate, without a named date of exclusion. Codex Sinaiticus is at the British Library in London. The page where the Shepherd of Hermas begins, immediately after Revelation, is digitized and publicly accessible. The same vellum, the same hand. No line was drawn between the canonical and the non-canonical by the scribes who wrote it. The line was drawn later, by others, for reasons that were never formally recorded. Number 9. The Didache. In 1873, Philotheos Bryennios, Metropolitan of Sarais in Greece, later Patriarch of Nicomedia, was cataloging manuscript holdings at the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Constantinople when he found an 11th century codex known as the Codex Hierosolymitanus. Inside it was a document bearing a title that Clement of Alexandria and Eusebius had both referenced, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, the Didache. He published it 10 years later, in 1883. What the Didache described about the earliest Christian communities would eventually force scholars to ask which came first, the doctrine or the institution that made the doctrine mandatory. The scholarly consensus dates the Didache between 50 and 120 AD, with Aaron Milivek of the Pontifical College Josephinum arguing in his 2003 study that core sections originated as early as the mid-1st century, contemporary with or predating Paul's later letters. Jonathan Draper at the University of KwaZulu-Natal has published extensively on the Jewish-Christian communal framework embedded in its legal structure. The mainstream reading of the Didache frames it as a primitive community document, an early developmental stage of Christianity reaching toward the mature institutional expression that came later. That framing encounters a problem when the actual content is read carefully. The Didache does not describe a community reaching toward something. It describes a community that is already complete within its own framework, and the framework is not the one the institutional church would subsequently build. The Eucharist it prescribes contains no reference to the crucifixion, no body, no blood, no atonement theology. The Thanksgiving prayers invoke the vine of David and the bread scattered on the mountains, Jewish liturgical forms in which Jesus is present as messianic fulfillment. not as atoning sacrifice. The meal is not theologically incomplete. It is complete within a different theology. The leadership structure is more destabilizing. Itinerant apostles and prophets are the primary community authorities. A traveling apostle who remains more than 2 days is, the text states, a false prophet. Local bishops and deacons are acknowledged as performing the same functions as prophets, and the community is explicitly told not to despise them. That instruction implies the despising was happening and required a corrective. The permanent episcopal hierarchy that would govern Christianity for the next 2 millennia, fixed bishops with territorial authority, dogmatic jurisdiction, the institutional power to define and prosecute heresy, does not exist in this document. It is not described. It is not anticipated. Consider the implication. The institution that spent subsequent centuries executing thousands for deviating from orthodox doctrine did not have those doctrines when the earliest surviving Christian manual was written. The creedal requirements, the episcopal authority, the atonement theology, none of it is present in the oldest surviving document of Christian community practice. The doctrine was not in place when the teaching began. What became heresy was what the original looked like before the hierarchy arrived to define it. The Didache still exists in the Codex Hierosolymitanus, held in the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem. The community it describes, prophets ranked above bishops, Eucharist without atonement, no creedal requirement for membership, has not existed since the permanent institutional structure was constructed over it. The structure arrived. What was underneath it did not survive. Number 8, the vote. In 1740, Ludovico Antonio Muratori, scholar and chief archivist of the Ambrosian Library in Milan, was cataloging manuscripts when he found an 8th century Latin codex containing a fragment of an extremely early Christian text. The parchment was water damaged. Its opening lines were completely gone. What survived was crude Latin. Scholars identify it as a translation from a Greek original, describing which Christian text the author's community considered authoritative around 170 to 200 AD. Muratori published his finding that year. It is now the oldest surviving Christian canon list in existence. But the fragment's most destabilizing content is not the specific texts it includes or excludes. It is what the entire document reveals about the process that produced the Bible. The Muratorian fragment accepts the wisdom of Solomon, a text subsequently excluded from Protestant Bibles. It names an apocalypse of Peter alongside Revelation, noting that some churches resist its public reading, demonstrating that its contemporaries considered both apocalypses in active circulation and similar canonical standing. It firmly excludes letters circulating under Paul's name to the Alexandrians and to the Laodiceans, specifically because they were already known to be forgeries. The canon was not settled. The lines were not yet drawn. The author was managing an ongoing contested landscape of texts, competing for authority in 170–200 AD. The Council of Hippo in 393 AD, a regional North African council attended by Augustine of Hippo, produced the first formal list matching the 27 books of the modern New Testament. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD ratified the same list. What these councils produced was not a recognition of texts already understood as scripture from the beginning. The minutes show deliberation. The delegates voted on inclusion and exclusion. The outcome of those votes eliminated texts that had been cited as authoritative for 2 centuries. But here's where the institutional narrative of seamless apostolic transmission collapses. The process producing the Bible has always been described to congregations as recognition, the church identifying texts already universally understood as holy since the earliest days of Christianity. The Muratorian fragment proves this is incorrect. In 170–200 AD, 2 centuries of Christianity had produced no settled canon, contested at least 2 apocalypses, was already fighting forgeries circulating under Paul's name, and was still actively negotiating which texts held authority. What the councils of 393 and 397 AD performed was selection. The texts that survived those votes were given doctrinal permanence. The texts that failed were moved, over subsequent generations, from routine circulation to obscurity to non-existence. The minutes of the Council of Hippo have not survived in complete form. The Muratorian fragment sits in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, water-damaged, fragmentary, missing its own beginning. The oldest surviving record proving the Bible was assembled through competitive selection and formal votes has a hole where its opening used to be. What the opening said, what reasoning the author gave for why a canon list was necessary at all, is gone. Number 7. the word for heaven. The problem is embedded in the first verse of Genesis, not in its theology, not in its cosmology, but in its grammar, a single feature of the original Hebrew that has never once been reflected in the English translation, and whose implications have not been resolved by any mainstream commentary. The Hebrew word translated as heaven or the heavens is shamayim. Every Hebrew student learns early that the -ayim ending is a dual suffix. Hebrew has singular, dual, and plural, a singular form of the root, used for one of something, -ayim for two of something, -ayim for three or more. The dual form in Hebrew is specific and unambiguous. Inayim, two eyes, yadayim, two hands, aznayim, two ears. The dual suffix carries a precise semantic load. What makes this particularly unsettling is not merely the grammatical form itself. It is that the singular form, shame, exists in the Hebrew language. It is attested. It is available. And it is never used in the Hebrew Bible. Not once, in any book, in any verse. The author of Genesis, the author of every psalm, the author of every prophecy that references the heavens, every Hebrew writer across the entire corpus chose the dual or plural form and used the singular 0 times. The critical scholarly response offers two explanations. The first is the plural of majesty reading, that shamayim is an intensive or honorific plural, conveying grandeur rather than enumeration, the way Elohim functions in some interpretations. The second is cosmic architecture, that the dual form reflects an ancient understanding of a sky dome with two distinct layers. Neither explanation accounts for the total absence of the singular. If shamayim were a standard linguistic convention for the concept of sky or above, the singular form would appear somewhere in the Hebrew corpus for ordinary reference, the way English alternates heaven and heavens naturally. The singular is not avoided in some passages and used in others. It is never used. The language enforced the dual or plural form so consistently that no writer across the entire Hebrew scriptural tradition broke with it once. The New Testament adds a complication the plural form of shamayim did not create alone. Paul's letter, preserved in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, describes him as a man who was caught up to the third heaven, not the second, the third. Paul is not inventing a cosmological framework. He is referencing one his audience already knew, one evidently so well understood that it required no explanation in a letter to a community in Corinth. Whatever the full architecture of that framework was, it assumed multiple layers with distinct designations. The third presupposes the first and the second. The word is still in the first verse of Genesis, shamayim, the dual or plural construct. Every English Bible reads the heavens, or simply heaven with no grammatical notation. The Hebrew has not been changed. The translation has never been corrected. The singular form sits unused in the Hebrew lexicon, available but unchosen, its absence more legible than any usage would be. Number 6. The Book of Enoch and the Watchers. The text describes them as watchers, supernatural beings who descended from the summit of Mount Hermon in the days before the flood, took human wives, and produced offspring the text calls Nephilim. This is the Book of Enoch, and the particular passage is chapters 6 through 16, the Watcher's narrative, the section that was cited as authoritative scripture for at least 4 centuries of Judaism and early Christianity, before institutional pressure compressed what the text said and then removed the book from most canonical traditions entirely. The Book of Enoch is quoted directly and treated as authoritative in the canonical letter of Jude, verse 14. The letter of Jude is in every Bible. The text Jude quotes from is not. The author of 2 Peter draws on the same watcher tradition, specifically in chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, describing angels who sinned being cast to Tartaros and kept in chains of darkness until judgment. The Greek word Peter uses is Tartaros, a term taken directly from Greek cosmological vocabulary, referring to the deepest pit of the underworld. That word does not appear anywhere else in the New Testament. The author reached for a specific extra-canonical vocabulary to describe something that required it. For the institutional argument that the Watcher's narrative was always understood as allegory, several facts resist the framework. 7 copies of the Watcher's section from 1 Enoch were found at Qumran. Fragment designations 4Q201 through 4Q202 contain multiple copies of chapters 1 through 36. The Dead Sea community treated this text with a frequency and reverence matched only by Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah within their collection. At Qumran, Enoch was not fringe literature. It was canonical to the community that preserved the oldest surviving Hebrew biblical manuscripts. What followed is traceable. At the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, the assembled bishops voted to bar the reading of non-canonical books in church services, though the council did not produce a finalized list. The Synod of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 solidified the canonical boundaries. Augustine, who was present and influential, wrote in the City of God that the Watcher interpretation of Genesis 6 was possible, but that he preferred the Sethite reading, in which sons of God referred to the righteous descendants of Seth, and daughters of men referred to the descendants of Cain. The Sethite interpretation had no prior tradition. Augustine's endorsement gave it institutional weight. But here's where the standard account fails to address the most specific evidence. Jude did not merely allude to Enoch. He named Enoch, named him as the seventh from Adam, and cited a specific prophetic statement from a specific text with a specific date attached to the prophecy. That is not a general cultural reference. That is the practice of a writer treating another text as scripture, citing it the way the canonical texts cite each other. If Jude's citation is treated as inspired scripture, and Jude's citation is of the Book of Enoch, the evidentiary burden for excluding Enoch falls on whoever excludes it. The canonical text contains the citation. The institution removed the cited source. 7 copies of the Watchers section still sit in the Israel Antiquities Authority's collection. Jude verse 14 still names Enoch. The specific word the mountain bears, Hermon, encoding the Hebrew herem meaning oath or curse, still identifies the site. The mountain has not moved. The ancient name has not been changed. The etymology is still visible in the consonants. Number 5. The real calendar. The discovery arrived in fragments. Cave 4 at Qumran yielded the fragments designated 4Q320 through 4Q330, texts dealing with a priestly calendar unlike anything in the received Hebrew tradition. John Strugnell at Harvard Divinity School and Shemariahu Talman at Hebrew University in Jerusalem worked separately through different fragments of the same system. When the analysis was complete, the calendar those fragments described was not a variant of the familiar Jewish lunisolar calendar. It was a 364-day solar calendar, perfectly divisible into 52 weeks, in which every festival fell on the same day of the week every year, and in which no festival ever fell on the Sabbath. The implications for the received understanding of the Hebrew festival system, and for specific events described in the canonical New Testament, have never been fully addressed by mainstream scholarship. The calendar appears in Jubilees, which the Qumran community treated as authoritative. It appears in 1 Enoch's astronomical book, chapters 72 through 82. It appears in the fragmentary Mishmarot texts from Cave 4, texts governing the rotation of priestly divisions through a solar year framework. Annie Joubert, a French scholar working in the 1950s, proposed in a 1957 paper that this 364-day solar calendar resolves one of the most intractable problems in the canonical Passion narrative: the apparent conflict in dating between the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the Gospel of John on when the Last Supper occurred. The Synoptics place the Last Supper on Passover evening. John places the Passover meal a day later, with Jesus being crucified at the hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. Both chronologies are internally consistent. Both cannot be correct on the same calendar. Joubert's reconstruction, developed further by researchers including Roger Beckwith at Latimer House, Oxford, proposed that the Last Supper was held on Tuesday evening of Passover week on the solar calendar, while the temple establishment operated on the lunisolar calendar, placing the official Passover on Thursday. This would give a Wednesday arrest, a sequence of trials across Wednesday night and Thursday, a Friday crucifixion on the official Passover date, and a timeline that accommodates every event the canonical accounts describe without compression. The truly unsettling aspect is not the chronological reconstruction. It is what the solar calendar's existence at Qumran reveals about the canonical tradition's completeness. If the earliest Jewish Christian communities were operating on a festival calendar that had already been displaced by the official temple calendar, then the entire liturgical architecture of canonical Christianity, the precise timing of the Passion, the specific date of Passover, the meaning of Jesus as the Passover lamb, is calibrated to an official institutional calendar that had already suppressed an older, more precisely structured system. The texts describing that older system are in fragments from Cave 4. The calendar they describe still reconciles the chronological conflict that has not been resolved by any mainstream commentary operating exclusively from the received tradition. Fragment 4Q320 is in the Israel Antiquities Authority collection, The Passion chronology conflict between the Synoptics and John is still in every Bible. Jobert's 1957 paper is still in academic circulation, still unrefuted. The reconciling framework is still in the fragments. The official calendar, used to harmonize the accounts, is still producing the inconsistency the fragments dissolve. Number 4. The names that were removed. In 1947, the same year the first Dead Sea Scrolls were identified in Cave 1, a fragment was recovered that would not be fully analyzed and published for decades. The section of text under examination was Deuteronomy 32-8, the Song of Moses. The received Hebrew text, the Masoretic tradition preserved through centuries of rabbinic scholarship and forming the textual basis of every major English Old Testament, reads, "He set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel." The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment designated 4Q Dot reads, "He set the boundaries of the nations according to the number of the sons of God." Bene Elohim, not the sons of Israel. The sons of God, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures completed in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, several centuries before the Masoretic text was standardized, also reads, "Sons of God," matching the Dead Sea Scrolls fragment and predating the Masoretic substitution by roughly a millennium. Patrick Scahan at Catholic University of America analyzed the 4Q Dot fragments in detail. Emmanuel Tav at Hebrew University has addressed the Septuagint alignment extensively in his work on the textual history of the Old Testament. The theological implications of the substitution are precise. In the received Masoretic text, Deuteronomy 32-8 describes God dividing the nations according to the count of the sons of Israel, 70 descendants of Jacob listed in Genesis 46. An administrative act, a population census becomes a cartographic framework. In the Dead Sea Scrolls version, confirmed by the Septuagint, God divided the nations and assigned each nation to one of the sons of God, the Bene Elohim, the divine council members described in Genesis 6, Job 1, Psalm 82, and Daniel 10. One supernatural being governing each nation, with Israel reserved as the Lord's personal inheritance. Deuteronomy 32-9 follows in both versions. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. The verse only functions as a meaningful contrast if the surrounding nations were allotted to someone else. In the Masoretic reading, all nations, including Israel, are already the Lord's. The verse loses its contrast. In the Dead Sea Scrolls reading, Jacob is distinguished from the other nations precisely because the others were given to the divine council members, while Jacob was kept for the Lord himself. What makes this particular substitution more significant than a standard scribal variant is what it connects to elsewhere in the canonical text. Psalm 82, in the text that sits in every modern Bible, unchanged, describes God standing in the divine assembly and pronouncing judgment on the gods, plural lowercase, condemning them for judging unjustly in the nations under their governance. The connection is not implied, it is structural. If Deuteronomy 32-8 originally assigned the nations to these divine beings, then Psalm 82's condemnation of those beings for their governance failures is the direct sequel. Remove the assignment from Deuteronomy 32-8, and the condemnation in Psalm 82 loses its context. The council governed badly. God revoked their governance. The architectural sequence across two books only holds with the original reading. The Masoretic text changed one phrase. That change did not eliminate the council from the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 82 still describes it. Daniel 10 still names a prince of Persia and a prince of Greece as distinct supernatural entities contending with the divine messenger. The council did not disappear from the canonical text. The framework for understanding why it existed, the assignment of nations in Deuteronomy 32-8, was what was changed. The architecture was left standing, with one of its foundational beams replaced. The older beam is in the fragments. The Septuagint preserved it. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserved it. The received Hebrew tradition does not. Number 3. The suppressed resurrection account. It arrived at the Coptic Museum in Cairo in 1945 as part of the Nag Hammadi codices. 13 leather-bound volumes, pulled from a sealed jar near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt by a farmer named Muhammad Ali Saman, who recognized the jar as a possible burial container, but smashed it open anyway, releasing what would become the most significant collection of early Christian texts discovered in the modern era. Among the 52 tractates in the collection was a text that the church father Irenaeus of Lyons had explicitly attacked by name in his work Adversus Heresies, written around 180 AD. This was proof of the text's existence and circulation in the 2nd century, and proof of why it had been removed. The Gospel of Philip. James Robinson at the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University led the major English language scholarly edition. The text is Coptic, and it is a translation from a Greek original, which researchers date to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. But embedded within its sayings and reflections is a concept that draws on a framework Irenaeus found unacceptable: the bridal chamber as the highest sacrament. Philip's theology of the resurrection does not function within the body-vacated tomb framework. The text describes resurrection not as an event to be awaited after bodily death, but as a condition entered in the present. Through a specific sacramental experience, it calls the bridal chamber. The text explicitly states that those who do not receive the bridal chamber in this life will not receive it in the other. The resurrection is not a post-mortem event. It is a present transformation, an entrance into a different state of being that the author describes as the restoration of the original unity lost at the fall. Irenaeus was furious, not with the abstract theology, but with the practical consequence. If resurrection is present experience available through initiation, the institutional church's authority over the future resurrection of its members is eliminated. The church held, and continued to hold, that resurrection was a future bodily event controlled by doctrinal membership. A community teaching that resurrection was accessible now through a sacramental framework outside episcopal authority was not a theological deviation. It was an institutional threat. The Synod of Carthage in 397 AD produced the final list. Philip was not on it. By the time Muhammad Ali's hammer hit the jar in 1945, the Gospel of Philip had not been read publicly in roughly 1,600 years. What the standard dismissal, Gnostic compilation, 2nd century fabrication, theologically peripheral, cannot account for is the specific content the Gospel of Philip shares with texts that survived canonization. Philip describes 5 sacraments: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and bridal chamber. The first 3 are canonical sacraments. The Church retained the sacramental framework, but removed the final 2 stages of the sequence. If Philip is a late Gnostic fabrication with no authentic tradition behind it, the retention of the first 3 sacraments in canonical practice while eliminating the final 2 requires explanation. The text that was removed shares sacramental architecture with the texts that were kept, which means either the entire framework is a later invention, including the canonical portion, or something of the original sequence was preserved in Philip after the canonical tradition had already been edited. The jar Muhammad Ali Saman broke open in 1945 no longer exists. The 52 tractates it contained are in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The Gospel of Philip occupies Codex 2, pages 51 through 86. The last complete Christian community known to have practiced the bridal chamber sacrament was destroyed when the Cathar movement was exterminated in southern France, across the 13th century crusade, including the siege of Montségur in 1244, where the final Cathar stronghold fell and its remaining perfecti were burned. Whatever they preserved of that sequence ended on that hillside. What survives is the text, the Coptic pages, the architecture of a sacramental system the canonical tradition contains in fragments. Number 2. The Divine Counsel, Psalm 82, is in every Bible. It has always been in every Bible. The text has not been suppressed, redacted, or removed. What has been suppressed is the framework that makes it legible, because without that framework, the psalm appears to be a metaphor. With it, the psalm is a governance record. The psalm opens, God stands in the divine assembly. Among the gods, he renders judgment. The Hebrew is unambiguous. The word translated gods is Elohim, the same word used for God throughout Genesis. The psalm is not describing God judging humans, or judging human judges using the metaphor of gods. It is describing God rendering judgment against other Elohim, plural divine beings, gathered in a formal assembly. The condemned beings are charged with unjust governance. They have failed to uphold justice, failed to rescue the weak, failed to deliver the poor from the hand of the wicked. The psalm ends with God pronouncing their death sentence. They will die like mortals and fall like any prince. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment, 11Q Melchizedek, identified from Cave 11 at Qumran and published by A.S. van der Woude in 1965, uses Psalm 82 as the scriptural framework for a text in which Melchizedek, described as a divine figure, presides over the judgment of the divine council at the end of the final Jubilee period. The Qumran community read Psalm 82 not as a metaphor, but as a literal description of a divine governance structure that was failing and was subject to end-time adjudication. The Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra in Syria, recovered between 1929 and 1939 and published progressively through the mid-20th century, describe a divine council called the Assembly of El, presided over by El as the chief deity, with subordinate divine beings assigned governance of the nations. The Ugaritic Council has specific structural parallels to the Hebrew Divine Council in Psalm 82, a presiding deity, a formal assembly, subordinate divine figures with administrative roles. The texts are Canaanite. They predate the Hebrew biblical corpus's final editorial stage. The structural parallel is not coincidental. The Hebrew tradition and the Canaanite tradition preserved the same governing body because they emerged from a shared cultural context, and the Hebrew tradition preserved it in canonical form, in Psalm 82, unedited, where it remains readable to anyone who reads the Hebrew carefully. The suppression was not of the text. The text is right there. The suppression was of the interpretive framework that makes the text coherent. Michael Heiser, who held a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who served as academic editor for Logos Bible Software before his death in 2023, spent decades documenting what he called the Divine Council worldview in peer-reviewed publications and in The Unseen Realm, published by Lexham Press in 2015. His central argument was not theological, it was textual. The Hebrew Bible consistently depicts God as the head of a divine assembly of lesser Elohim, and this framework is visible in the canonical text in at least a dozen passages across Genesis, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, Daniel, and the prophets. But centuries of interpretive tradition have flattened or metaphorized those passages to avoid engaging with the cosmological model they collectively describe. The truly unsettling implication is not the existence of the divine council in the text. It is that the framework for reading it coherently was available in the canonical text all along, and what required suppression was not a verse or a book, but a way of reading. The church did not need to remove Psalm 82. It needed to teach congregations that Elohim, in that psalm, meant something other than what the word means everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. The strategy worked at institutional scale for centuries. The psalm is still there. The Hebrew word is still there. The Ugaritic parallel is published. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragment applying the psalm to a divine judgment framework is cataloged. The interpretive apparatus that made the original reading disappear was not an archive. It was a sermon. Number 1. The name. In 1975, a routine salvage excavation was underway in Jerusalem's Ophel, the ridge south of the Temple Mount, under the oversight of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. The work was not glamorous. Construction was expanding, and salvage archaeology is the process of recording what exists before machinery removes it. The team was moving through destruction debris. Then the pick struck something hard, and the excavator felt the distinctive solidity of cut stone beneath the rubble. Working more carefully now, the team uncovered a section of floor belonging to a First Temple period structure, a building from the 8th or 7th century BC, contemporary with the kings of Judah. Beneath the floor, in a sealed locus, they found a collection of clay bullae, personal seals pressed into clay, used to authenticate documents. The bullae had survived because the structure they were stored in had burned, and the fire had hardened the clay that a flood or the passage of time would have dissolved. There were hundreds of them. Most bore names. Many of those names appear in no other source, but one name would not be fully processed for decades. In 2009, Eilat Mazar of Hebrew University, excavating in a different part of the Ophel, found a bulla in a sealed locus she dated to the late 8th century BC. The seal it bore reads, in ancient Hebrew script, belonging to Yehuchal son of Shelemiah, son of Shovi, Yehuchal ben Shelemiah. The same name appears in Jeremiah chapter 37 and chapter 38, where a court official by exactly that name is listed among those who conspired to have Jeremiah imprisoned. The bulla named a specific person. The book named the same person. The dates matched. But the bulla sequence that follows from Mazar's work and from the earlier Ophel work compiled by Yair Shoham and published by the Israel Exploration Society in 2000 is not the specific devastation. It is the context for it. Because the bullae collection from the Ophel destruction confirms what the text of Jeremiah had always implied. The administrative apparatus of the late Judahite kingdom was exactly as the text described it. Specific named officials, specific titles, specific family patronymics, confirmed in clay pressed from personal seals in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. The text was not recording mythology, it was recording office. In 2018, Mazar published the results of her analysis of a bulla found in her 2009 to 2010 excavation season. The seal reads, Yeshayahu Navi, Isaiah the prophet. The bulla was found approximately 3 meters from a bulla previously identified as belonging to Hezekiah, king of Judah, the king and the prophet who advised him in 2 Kings chapters 19 and 20, in Isaiah chapters 36 through 39, physically confirmed in authenticated clay from the same sealed destruction locus 3 meters apart from each other in Jerusalem dirt. Mazar herself was careful. The Isaiah bulla's final letter is partially damaged. The he at the end of the word that would make it unambiguously the prophet is incomplete. She presented both readings, Isaiah the prophet and Isaiah. Navi, where Navi would be a personal name rather than the title. The physical proximity to Hezekiah's seal, the dating to the correct period, and the correct spelling of the name in correct ancient Hebrew script form the evidentiary foundation. Mazar noted the uncertainty, the evidence of proximity and period she documented without qualification. What the standard account of the Isaiah bulla controversy does not address is the second-order implication. The argument over whether the final letter confirms prophet is a legitimate paleographic dispute. But even in the most conservative reading, where the damaged letter does not settle the question, the bulla names in Isaiah from 8th century BC Jerusalem in a sealed locus 3 meters from Hezekiah's confirmed seal. Isaiah is a name. Hezekiah is a name. The book bears the first name. The 2 Kings account names both in the same institutional relationship. The conservative reading of the bulla still confirms an Isaiah contemporary with Hezekiah in the court context, where both names appear together in the text. But the suppression is not of the bulla. The bulla was published. It is accessible. The suppression of this entry is older, more complete, and more consequential, and it is encoded in a word. The book of Isaiah has been the subject of a sustained scholarly consensus, beginning in the late 18th century with Johann Christoph Doderlein's 1775 analysis. That the book is received is the work of at least 2 authors, chapters 1 through 39, composed by the historical Isaiah in the 8th century BC, and chapters 40 through 66, sometimes subdivided further, composed by one or more anonymous authors writing during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. The argument rests on vocabulary differences, geographic references, and the fact that chapters 40 through 66 address conditions of exile and restoration that had not yet occurred when the historical Isaiah was alive. Cyrus of Persia is named in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, and chapter 45, verse 1, by name, as the ruler who will authorize the restoration of Jerusalem, at a point when Cyrus had not yet been born. The scholarly consensus resolves this with compositional theory. The text was written later and attributed to Isaiah. The prophecy is post-eventum, written after the fact and placed in the 8th century prophet's voice. This is the roadblock, and it is a serious one. The vocabulary argument is real. The geographic shift is real. The naming of Cyrus before Cyrus's birth is the most specific version of the problem, and scholarship has debated it for 250 years. Now the counter-evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a complete scroll of Isaiah. The Great Isaiah Scroll, designated 1Q Isa A, found in Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947 and dated by carbon-14 analysis to approximately 125 to 100 BC. It is the oldest complete manuscript of any biblical book in existence. It contains all 66 chapters, and it contains no break, no scribal division, no section heading, no structural indication of any kind between chapter 39 and chapter 40. The scroll continues uninterrupted, a scribe copying the Isaiah text in 125 BC, working from earlier Vorlage documents now lost, produced a single unified document with no indication that a compositional seam existed between what modern scholarship calls 1st Isaiah and 2nd Isaiah. A second Qumran Isaiah scroll, 1Q Isa B, also contains material from both proposed sections without any indication of structural division at chapter 40. John C. Trevor photographed the Great Isaiah Scroll in 1948, within weeks of its arrival at the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. The photographs showed scholars worldwide what the scroll contained. The entire subsequent debate about Deutero-Isaiah has proceeded in full knowledge that the oldest surviving copy of Isaiah does not reflect the compositional seam the theory requires. The New Testament citations complicate the matter further. John chapter 12, verses 38 through 41, quotes from both sections of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 1, and chapter 6, verse 10, and attributes both quotations to Isaiah, a single author. The evangelist was not working from a divided text. Paul's letter to the Romans, in chapter 10, verses 16 and 20, does the same. Quotes from Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 65 in the same passage, and attributes both to Isaiah by name. If the compositional division were already understood in the first century, the New Testament writers were either careless or working from a tradition that had not yet divided the text. But here's where the full weight lands. Not on the compositional debate, not on the scroll evidence, but on the specific name. The word for prophet in Hebrew is Navi, Nun, Bet, Aleph. It appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as a title identifying those who receive and transmit divine communications. It is a functional designation. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 1 identifies him as Isaiah son of Amoz, who received visions concerning Judah and Jerusalem during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. The text spans 4 kings, 4 reigns, a roughly 40-year active ministry according to the text's own internal chronology. If the Deutero-Isaiah hypothesis is correct, then the text describing exile conditions, naming Cyrus by name, and addressing a community experiencing the consequences of Babylonian conquest was written by a figure or figures who possessed either A. detailed political intelligence about conditions 150 years in the future, the capacity to extrapolate from contemporary political trends with precision that outstrips any other predictive text in the ancient record, or C. access to information the text does not explain. The Isaiah scroll does not divide. The New Testament cites both halves as one author. The bulla bearing the name Isaiah was found 3 meters from the bulla bearing the name of the king whose court Isaiah served. And the text, whichever compositional theory is applied to it, contains, in chapter 44 verses 24 through 28 and chapter 45 verse 1 through 7, a first-person divine declaration addressed to a named foreign king who would not be born for over a century, specifying that this king would authorize the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the restoration of the temple foundation. Cyrus issued the Edict of Cyrus in 538 BC. The exile ended. The temple was rebuilt. The text named the mechanism by which this would happen at a point when the Babylonian Empire was still at its peak. Jerusalem had not yet fallen, and no contemporary observer had any basis for predicting that a Persian king would become the dominant power in the ancient Near East. The Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isa, A, is in the shrine of the book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It is on permanent public display. All 66 chapters on a single scroll, with no break between the section scholars have debated for 250 years. A monk in the Qumran community, copying text from earlier manuscripts around 125 BC, did not divide the book. Whatever the original document was, however it came to say what it says about Cyrus and exile and restoration, it arrived at Qumran as a single unified text. The Isaiah bulla sits in the Israel Museum. The Hezekiah bulla sits 3 meters from where it was found. The scroll that contains both halves of the text, undivided, written before the debate that would eventually divide it, is behind glass in Jerusalem. The book names a king. The clay names the prophet. The gap between the writing and the fulfillment is still the part no framework, compositional or otherwise, has fully closed.